Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone across the globe joining us today. This is Bridget from Acquia. Today's webinar is Personalization with Purpose with Mike Miles and Gordon Porter from Genuine and Eric Fullerton from Acquia. Just a couple housekeeping items before we get started. If you have any audio issues, please send them in the Q&A tab and I will assist you. If you have any questions for the presenters, please submit them in the Q&A tab as well, and they will answer them at the end of the presentation. Slides and the recording of this webinar will be posted to acquia.com and also sent to you via email within the next few days. And without further ado, I will pass it over to Mike.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Miles. I'm the VP of Technology at Genuine. I'm also our Drupal Technology Lead. Been working in this industry for 10 years and excited to talk with you about personalization.
Great. I'm Gordon Porter. I'm an engagement lead here at Genuine on our strategy team. My work really focuses on working with our partners directly to frame their marketing objectives, understand their users and their data, then use those inputs to design both programs and digital experiences that drive value. So as part of that, I've worked with a lot of organizations to plan and implement personalization programs, both from the ground up as well as growing existing programs. So really excited to speak with you all today and share some of our approach.
And I'm Eric Fullerton. I'm on the product marketing side here at Acquia. I look after our marketing cloud, which we'll talk about really briefly in a minute, but working with customers, with partners, folks like Genuine, and of course, lots of different prospects as well to try to understand not only the value of personalization, but how to bring this actually into a practice and start to see some success and measurable results. So we've got a great agenda for you here today in terms of what we're going to cover in this webinar. I'm going to do a really brief overview. We've got some great, really quick updates on the Acquia side around some products things and some really exciting news. And then we're going to dive really deep. The vast majority of this webinar, we're going to hear from Mike and from Gordon, who have some really great expertise on some of the commonly seen problems when implementing personalization. We'll talk through some methods for creating a personalization program. We have 3 case studies as well with each of these different sections. And then we'll talk through some of the long-term personalization benefits. And at the end, we'll talk through a little bit about some strategy components to these programs. So really excited about this webinar. But before we get started, I just want to make sure for folks who maybe are joining one of our webinars for the first time to do just a little bit of due diligence on Acquia. We're the open source digital experience company. Of course, we work with Drupal and great partners like Genuine and those who I help build really amazing digital experiences on Drupal. We've got thousands of customers, lots of different Fortune 100 customers with really powerful, robust global partner program. We're over 900, just about 1,000 employees this year. And this year at Acquia, we had a really amazing year. 2019 was probably the biggest year in Acquia's history. And I just wanted to take a chance to update some of the folks on some of the things that we accomplished this year. Of course, there was an acquisition. We were acquired by Vista Partners, which is really exciting for us in terms of driving more innovation. But we had a great year outside of that as well. In 2019, we had 5 new products, 70 new features. We acquired 3 companies, Cohesion, Modic, and most recently Agile One, while still maintaining our commitment to open source and to Drupal. So a really exciting year for us. And we also, because of some of these great improvements, we've really reframed the way we're thinking about our open digital experience platform. We've organized what many had, maybe in the past you could think of as a little bit of a complex product portfolio into really 3 very clean and clear clouds geared towards our customers and our audiences. The Drupal cloud, our content cloud for content authors and headless experiences, and the marketing cloud around connecting, personalizing, engaging with customers. And for this webinar, of course, we're talking about personalization and a personalization practice. So we're going to kind of double click here on the marketing cloud, talk a little bit about personalization and why you're on the line here, why you should be focused on personalization, and share some metrics and stats with you there. So one of my favorite statistics on this is that 89% of digital businesses are investing in personalization. Maybe 1 to 2 years ago, we were almost still kind of making the case on why people should be thinking about this. Now we're actually showing the amount of adoption that exists in the industry. So we're seeing a lot of investment. We've seen some really great statistic in terms of that being borne out in reality, increases in sales opportunities when leads are nurtured with personalized content. We're also seeing a trend moving away from point solutions and more aligning to content management systems as a way for marketers to leverage personalization technology. And of course, this is all driven by customer experience and the expectation of consumers today. Consumers have incredibly high expectations for performance and for content and for experience. In fact, in this statistic from Marketo, 79% say they're only likely to engage with an offer after it's been personalized. So that's really great, right? Personalization, we're seeing a lot of momentum and traction there. But unfortunately, personalization is not always the easiest thing to do, especially when we're thinking about web personalization and content personalization on the website. It requires a lot of awareness. It requires a lot of data collection. It requires some level of expertise. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the gaps around personalization and where we're missing, and then really how we can build a successful practice in personalization.
Yeah, so leading off from that, a lot of organizations are implementing personalization, and unfortunately, some are not doing it as well as they could, and some are succeeding. So we see this gap in the work we've done, where I would say people have failed in personalization, meaning they've implemented it, but they haven't gotten any return on value. They haven't improved the experience for their customers, their clients. And then obviously there are people who have done it well, where they see success, they see a return on investment, they see increased customer engagement. And this gap, from our experience, comes from a couple of misconceptions and assumptions that people have about personalization. And I want to address those first before we get into how then you can rectify those and build a successful personalization process. So the first misconception people usually have is that they assume personalization is just a product you buy. This is incorrect. Now, technology obviously plays a big part in personalization. You need a personalization engine, you need tools around it, which we'll talk about later on, to implement it. But if you're relying on just throwing a bunch of money at a software you can purchase, you're not going to have any success. It involves knowing what you want to personalize, why you want to personalize content, what goals you're trying to reach from it. So it's more than this product, but it's everything around that to build up why you need that product. Another misconception people have is they assume personalization is just a button you push. That sure, you purchase some technology, you implement it in a CMS, you implement it with your technology stack, and then when you want to, quote, personalize content, for a certain persona, a certain user base, there's a button you can push that will change that content to meet their needs. And that's, again, incorrect assumption, because you need a team in place, you need content in place that you can then use to target towards specific customers, specific clients based on their facets and needs. So what we've seen leads people towards success is thinking of personalization as a program you create in your organization. It's all about building up the processes, the people, the content, and the tools that you need to deliver the right content to the right people at the right time. And so when you're able to build out a program and turn it into something that you can continually iterate on, that's where we see people really succeed with personalization. So when I'm talking about creating a personalization program, there are three parts of it. The first is learning how to assess opportunity, understanding why you want to implement personalization, what you want to accomplish with it, and what opportunities you have available for you and for your customers. From there, it's defining what goals mean that your personalization is successful. So coming up with success metrics for knowing what you want to achieve and how you're going to measure if you're getting that return on investment for implementing personalization. And this allows you to then define those goals across your organization, to share them out to make sure everyone's on the same page. And having those goals, having that pathway, allows you to then develop a strategy for implementing personalization, a strategy around figuring out who you're going to target, figure out what content you're going to personalize, figure out what processes you're going to put in place, and then also figure out what technologies make the best sense for you to implement it. Thinking through these three pieces, build that implementation program, allows you to implement it and put it into practice. And then from there, you can start implementing personalization in your digital technologies from your website, your CMS to your social channels, wherever you want to target your audience, you have these three core pieces that allow you to do it repeatedly, do it with a purpose, and make sure everyone knows what you're trying to achieve. So what we want to do is go through each one of these pieces of creating a personalization program to give you an overview of the tools that you can do in your organization to build this personalization program yourself. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gordon to talk about assessing opportunities.
All right. Thank you, Mike. All right. So the focus of the session today is really about being purposeful as you do personalization. I'm going to unpack what that means in a minute, but I just want to acknowledge first, I imagine that, among all of us on the call, we're in various stages of actually approaching or doing personalization. So some of us might have programs stood up and running, and you're looking to scale those efforts and get more sophisticated. Some of you might be planning or about to launch your first pilot program. And others might just be sort of trying to wrap their heads around what personalization is and how to approach it overall. So as we laid out what we want to cover today, we're cognizant of all those different need states. And I think, what you'll see today is we're covering is something that's quite useful regardless of where you are. The other thing too is, any webinar that I join, I want something out of this that I can take away as sort of a tool or a framework or templates even to use on my end. So we tried to structure it in a way that you hopefully can use some of these inputs that we're going to share with you. And actually, regardless of where you are, use them to drive value moving forward. So with that being said, when we say being purposeful with personalization, it does apply to that full spectrum, right? So whether you're just getting started or you might already be in motion, what we're going to talk through is part of our planning framework. So it's what we use with our partners. So either setting up a program from the ground up or growing an existing one. We have some time constraints today, obviously. So what we're going to focus on is squarely the planning piece. We're going to get into a couple different aspects towards the end around not just the planning, but actually, putting pen to paper and getting really tactical. And also some notes on just technology and program structure overall. But, I think regardless of where you are, it's critical and really valuable to be deliberate about defining that purpose up front. So ultimately, you can create a plan and then eventually a program around personalization that's both grounded in reality for your organization and your team, but is also achievable and holds people and the team accountable. So that being said, when we first engage with our partners to create that plan, we start with a somewhat sobering question, which was on the previous slide. Can personalization deliver real value to your organization? And if we cut to the chase, the answer to that is often a very resounding yes, right? It's not surprising. There are countless ways that we can drive value by providing our audiences with a better experience. Personalization is really meant to deliver more relevant communications or offers or recommendations to users. So if you know X about a specific audience, how are you going to change your communication or offer to them so that's more relevant, more valuable, not just to them, but then in turn, your organization overall? So we start to qualify that question by asking, what value can it bring? What's the level of effort and the anticipated return on that effort? And then what's the time horizon for actually realizing that value? I think that's key as we begin to sort of right-size a program that's right for any given company or organization. So to back into an informed answer to those questions, we actually get more specific with the questions that we ask. So it's funny, usually when we surface these in the room and in one of our planning workshops, the immediate response can be something like a big heavy sigh or some degree of impatience. So it's like, oh gosh, can we cut to the chase? Like, can we get to the good stuff? Well, how about those journey maps that you like to do? And it's not surprising, right? It makes sense. Personalization, it's been around for a while. It's seen a pretty heavy uptick in adoption, and a lot of organizations are getting somewhat sophisticated with it, but it's still somewhat buzzwordy, but it's exciting and it's full of promise. So I think there's this tendency to push forward as quickly as possible and to get to that good stuff and that interesting stuff, and to try to get a solution stood up as quickly as possible. So usually when we surface these questions in our initial planning workshops, the team in a room is usually, they're thinking something like, yeah, we already know the answers to these. Let's get to the journey maps. But the point of going through this exercise, it's not to be, pedantic or to waste a few hours of whiteboarding or anything. It's really about being purposeful and doing that pre-planning work from the start. And asking these questions and bringing the right people to the room and getting the answers allows us to source and then map out the context of where you are and what your current state is, so that then you can then plan around those inputs. And when we work through these questions, the exercise always surfaces a lot of key background details. There's always good debate in the room. And it's focused around how the organization goes to market and what its users need, how its marketing and technologies and, everything down to customer service functions, how they operate. And so ultimately, the degree of personalization that the organization is ready for is framed around a lot of the answers to these questions. So it's really sort of a reality check for ensuring and then informing our future exercises together. So that's it. We're not going to go into these questions super in depth today, but I do want to give a sense of these questions that we do drill into, a couple different lenses that we approach this through. So for instance, fundamentally, what are we actually marketing? What are you selling? Are you B2B company? Do you go to market B2C? Are you a nonprofit or a healthcare institution? And, it really goes down to that question of how you go to market and then the ensuing outcomes that we need to drive through your digital channels that can be supported and bolstered through personalization. And, it's always, I think it's good to call out, we try to be very transparent here, inherently different categories come with different levels and opportunities for personalization. So, more or less, the more complex sales model of a, B2B SaaS, product or services organization requires a longer-term approach and a longer-term sort of mindset for personalization. As that type of company goes to market, there's often a lot of decision makers. They each have nuanced needs and behavior, different interests or jobs, and it's just a longer, more complex sales cycle, right? There's fewer real transactional exchanges. So there's typically a need for a lot of education and validation of those audiences, both to nurture them as leads and then confirm their buying decisions, which, may actually happen more as a committee instead of just an individual buying decision. And the other end, B2B services company, for example, there tends to be more of an immediate or direct path to transaction. So there's more opportunity to capture a lot of user information up front in relatively short order. For instance, if you have a website with a logged in, authenticated experience or an account experience where you're sourcing a lot of inputs from users. So it's important to keep in mind, both that access to user data and then the life cycle of user engagement are key inputs that basically allow you to do personalization. And then the next one here, I'm going to talk more about users a little later, but it's obviously really important to focus on them as early and as often as possible. And it's interesting as we move through these questions, we get a sense of how a given organization, given marketing teams frame their users and then work to communicate with them across their different channels. So, we ask, have you defined personas or segments yet? I'll get into the nuances between those and sort of how you can approach personalization through personas or segments, pros and cons for both. Are those personas or segments informed and validated with data yet? And really importantly, what data are you actually capturing across your channels to segment those audiences? And then ultimately, that data needs to feed back and actually be used to target those with relevant communications moving forward. We also look at, how does your team actually operate? So there's sometimes that, loving relationship between marketing and sales teams. How are you collectively or individually handling market segmentation? What's the ownership over those different channels and the leads that come in through those channels? So it becomes important to look at that, right? So how are you sharing that data, making sure that we're correctly attributing leads that come in, whether it's through a website or any other channel that you go to market with. And another good thing to note here, just a general best practice, especially as we start pre-planning workshops with our partners, we always recommend bringing in a full team to those planning discussions, right? So personalization is one of those funny things that it requires a lot of different roles and skill sets. So it's great to have different folks in the room with that specialized knowledge so that, all those outputs can be shared and we can plan collectively and get a lay of the land. And then ultimately, the people are in the room such that we can tie it all together, right? There's a lot of pieces that need to be tied together with personalization. Really quickly here too, from a technical standpoint, we look at the complexity of, the tools that you're using, how integrated are they, right? Are they talking to each other? Are you using APIs that connect the data? How organized is that data? And then we also talk about resources, right? I think resources is sort of what makes people's eyes roll around their head when they think about personalization. Personalization inherently comes with a big resource requirement, but not necessarily, right? Not necessarily as you start out. So like Mike said earlier, the program that you create for personalization, it needs people and processes and technology. So it's critical to be realistic about where you are and what you can support for each of these needs. So basically, so you can plan accordingly, right? And you get a program stood up that delivers value as quickly as possible. And like I said, really important to call out, you shouldn't shy away from starting personalization, even if your resource bandwidths aren't massive right now. We'll get to a case study later on that talks about that, but we've personally worked with a lot of companies, a lot of digital marketing teams that are relatively small, right? They might have 2, 3, 4 specialists on their team, and we can still set up personalization, right? You can start on your website. You have to implement the technology and be focused around how you structure a program, but you can get something stood up in relatively short order and start delivering value and begin building a business case by driving stronger results. And that's actually what we're going to talk about a lot today is how to do that really deliberately. So just to put a bow on all this, usually when our team goes through these planning questions in a workshop or two, what we do is we provide our partners with a readout that serves really as a maturity assessment, right? So it's capturing and reading back all these inputs alongside recommendations, either for where to begin or where to focus moving forward, just so that we start off on an informed and right foot. So with that, I'm going to hand it off for a quick case study.
Yeah, so a case study on this that we want to share was Kronos. So this is Kronos. They're a workforce management solutions company. They're global. They've been around since 1977. And a couple of years ago, I think it was 2017, Genuine, we worked with them to rebuild their main website, moving from .NET technologies to Drupal and Acquia. And we went through this sort of assessment while we were planning the architecture and the strategy for their website, thinking about there's a good opportunity here for personalization. And the way we came through that is asking these sort of questions that Gordon just proposed. So what do they market? We knew they marketed a workforce management solutions. Got an understanding they already knew who their users were. They've been around, again, since 1977. They have a very mature sales model. They know the industries that their software works for, that they want to branch into, and who uses it. So they focus on workers at all levels of organizations. They may target C-suite people for actually purchasing, or HR for purchasing, but it's the individuals who then have to know that they can use this successfully to track their time or track their people. So how do they go to the market? Is that they were already doing this with their sales team, is they were focusing on marketing towards specific industries and specific business needs. And so that really opened up an opportunity for personalization. These are two metrics that we can identify by site visitors, what industry they're in, what business need they currently have, and we could use that for personalization purposes. Their digital marketing was pretty mature. Again, they had a really mature sales funnel that they were using with other technologies like Marketo for tracking that. And their sales team was aligned on how to kind of help navigate customers or potential customers based on, again, their industries and their needs. With this, we assessed what technologies they were working with, what they were going to move to. They were going to move to Drupal, so we thought about what would make sense for when we're building this site with the team and their internal developers and their internal sales team and marketing team, what tools would make sense for that build. And then with the stories they could tell, they have a lot of content, a lot of case studies that they could share. Again, that if we mark them correctly with taxonomies, with industries and needs, we could use that for personalization purposes. And then we talked about what resources do you have to actually do this, and what can we focus on for this implementation. So they already had a team for rebuilding their website. They had a marketing team that was on board with the direction they wanted to go with the website, the direction they wanted to go with their messaging for their content. And so that really made it so that we could align on big impacts just to start on the home page, getting information about that user on their first page load, targeting that individual, learning about what industry they're part of, what business needs we can discover about them, and then changing out content on the page to show relevant case studies or show how Kronos works for their business needs. And building through these questions, asking these, and identifying this opportunity really helped us then to start to find goals on what they could achieve with personalization, and it led to a really successful implementation of personalization on the launch of their new site.
Yep.
But the next part was defining goals.
Yep. So at this point, we've established the context, where we are, where we're trying to go at a high level, right, depending on, where we are in this organization. So we turn to focusing on goals. So starting with that purpose, what do we do from here? So really important especially when you're starting to plan for personalization from the outset, or even if you do have a program up and running yet, map out some semblance of goals or objectives as a starting point. And the point here isn't to overdo it, right? We're not having some sort of semantic argument about goals versus objectives or anything, but it's really just mapping out 3 to 5 statements about what you're trying to achieve with this program. Digital is complex, so these goals serve as guideposts towards what the end outcomes are that you're trying to work towards. So it really allows us to also have a focused way of defining requirements against those goals so that we're organized and clear about the resources to support those outcomes. And like I said earlier, holding teams accountable for actually driving that success. So really it's asking 1 or 2 of these questions, right? So what are you trying to achieve? What value will it deliver? For a little inspiration to that end, we have some starting points that we typically use. And like I said earlier, if any of this content can help you, your organization with its efforts, these are good logical starting points, right? So what are goals for personalization? It's supporting primary audiences across different channels with more relevant context to boost conversions. It's tracking users and validating those different segments in order to evolve how we support their journeys. It's monitoring the engagement to improve our own content development efforts such that they align with the needs of our users. That's actually a really interesting point that shouldn't be lost either. There's sort of this 2-sided coin to personalization. You're using personalization to deliver better content to users, but you can also be really deliberate about how you're using that data to better your own content efforts moving forward. So it sort of serves the needs of many programs. And then ultimately, this gets more tactical, but developing and implementing more advanced scenarios that drive valuable user data capture. So that can be used not only for content delivery efforts in your marketing programs, but it can be used for marketing analytics and targeting in other areas of your business as well. So just some examples here. And then what we do is we recommend taking each goal and then mapping tactics and requirements that need to happen to drive that overall outcome. And these types of planning exercises and worksheets can get pretty detailed, and they should, right? It basically leaves us with a prioritized tactical roadmap for the specific efforts that need to happen to frame and stand up a program. So whether it's a pilot program or a really large sophisticated program with a really high degree of data and channel integration, we basically have our marching orders in place and a clear sense of what needs to get done and also the resources needed to do that work. So if you go through, you map out tactics, describe those tactics, you can assign owners to them, and ultimately, given where you are and where you want to head, you can prioritize each of these different requirements moving forward. And then important piece here, once you've actually gone through that exercise, ladder those goals up to a program vision, right? So you're kind of backing into an overall business case here. A little boilerplate here, but it's funny, we bring this program vision to a lot of our planning workshops, and a lot of organizations just adopt this outright, especially if they're standing up a program. But really, this is meant to encapsulate the overall meaning and value that personalization is meant to bring. So you can use this to, like I said, back into this and use this to source a business case moving forward to basically justify the value that you're bringing and hopefully get more investment for the program moving forward. So it's really sort of the rallying cry for the why behind personalization. And it's worth calling out, it's really the benefit of this planning approach as we see it. It's pretty straightforward, right? You're establishing your context, you are mapping out goals and then requirements and tactics and prioritizing them, and then socializing and formalizing a vision across, up and down your organization. But it really works. This overall approach gets a lot of organizations up and running in just a couple of weeks or up to 2 or 3 months, and it basically covers all the ground and holds people accountable. So highly recommend it.
Awesome. I'm going to jump in here and talk through a case study, Community Health Network, really good example of goal setting in the way that we've just seen to outline. So just a brief overview on Community Health Network, or CHN. They're Indiana's leading provider in convenient health access to healthcare. They were really founded by a group of neighbors in the 1950s, and now today they've scaled out, serving over 200 sites across central Indiana. So this is an organization in obviously healthcare, not one we would often think of as at the forefront of digital transformation or as personalization. They have a pretty small, pretty lean team. So for them, as they're undergoing this digital transformation, they were really focused and interested in using personalization and personalized content to engage their customers and their site visitors much more effectively. But for them, goal setting was really important. They had to do some validation, and they had to do some kind of almost like proving to some of the executives and the board across, making sure they were validating the investment, not just in digital, but in personalization. So for them on the prioritizing personalization on their .com, they aligned to some of the goal setting ideas that we heard earlier, which first was focusing on kind of these more robust user profiles, but really starting with 4 key business segments. And they worked with some of these business leaders to identify what they were. They got their buy-ins with a smaller team, very agile, got some buy-in from the executives around what these really valuable segments were. And then we're consistently adding to them, not just the baseline information you can collect around device and location, but starting to pull in engagement, interests, and past visits. And for them, they were really focused, and this is what we love about this story, on one key metric. So what was happening in previous instances was lots of people were calling the call center for CHN. And what that means is that's much more costly than folks who are requesting appointments online. So for CHN, part of the validation of personalization and investing in digital transformation was making more people request appointments online. So they saw some really great results. What I liked about this as well, they aligned it to a specific campaign as well, outside of just request an appointment. But for the general personalization practice based on those 4 segments, they were able to deliver personalized content to those individuals, guiding them through that content funnel on the site. They saw 3x conversion rate for people who saw personalized content. They were 3 times more likely to click on that request an appointment button online. They also aligned this to a very specific campaign. They were running an online mammogram screening campaign. And what they were able to do from a goal setting perspective is take some of those high level goals and then align them to a campaign they were running, content that they were already creating. And they saw, as you can see here, over 12% increase in the screenings that were booked online. So they're then validating that investment. Like we said, small team, very agile, wanting to have some quick results early, really good goal setting, aligning their personalization practice and program to those goals. So really nice story there around how to set and deliver on those goals.
All right, and we're going to take a few minutes now to talk about, at the point at which you've established those goals, how do we actually get tactical? And it's funny, strategy, as I see, as we see it, it's really just a more informed and deliberate approach about how to succeed. So strategy is, in my mind, nothing but a clear and coherent way to go about a given effort tactically. So we're already a large part of the way here, but worth calling out, we are surfacing this program planning framework as what we use, but it's important to take whatever framework you're presented or you research and make it work for your organization, right? So not to be overly prescriptive here, our process works really well, but understand sort of how your team and your organization functions, and whatever you adopt, make sure that you align it with your needs. So I'm going to walk through our sort of end-to-end approach here in a minute, but I also want to call out, it's funny as you scroll through your LinkedIn feed or you get like an email newsletter or anything, there's always pieces about personalization paralysis. Like that, I think the last 6 or 12 months, that's just been all over the place. Right-sizing personalization is another one that you hear a lot. If you click into those articles, sometimes they're insightful pieces. They can provide a unique angle about, what personalization is or how to do personalization. But having worked with a lot of different marketing teams to set up programs, the thing that we constantly hear about is that paralysis is really just not knowing the right tactical approach and then piecing it together in a logical cadence to either build out or grow a program. So when we work with organizations, particularly those that are just getting started, it's sort of a deer in the headlights situation a lot of the times. I think the complicated thing about personalization overall is, like I said earlier, it's about putting together a program that involves planning and implementing and then integrating a lot of different stuff. It's the user data, it's the technology, it's the content, And there are a ton of resources available online that give specific advice about how to do one or two of those different things or work streams, but that's about it. They're only really addressing one or two of the variables in what is sometimes, a fairly complicated equation to solve. So that's the benefit of going through an end-to-end planning exercise. It's why it can be beneficial too to bring in a partner to help with that process, especially if you're just trying to get a program set up. So unfortunately, we have limited time today, obviously, on this webinar, but the real value that we want to impart, aside from that context and goal setting piece, is actually how to begin thinking about getting tactical, right? Putting pen to paper and actually getting down to work. So before I wrap, this section is an overview of that process and some of the activities that we do to plan and implement programs and actually get down to work. So go through this. Basically what we're going to focus on today, right, I already talked about some of that pre-planning work, right? So setting context, defining goals, mapping that up to a program vision and having all your tactics and requirements mapped out underneath. But we're going to focus here on this boxed out section here and just give you a sense of some of the activities that we do, and we also have a couple templates in here that you can use moving forward here if it's helpful to you. So the first one is around mapping conversions, right? So it's important to set the context up front about which channels you're actually trying to personalize for, especially if you're starting out. The website is a great place to start for a lot of different reasons, which I won't get into, but be really deliberate about understanding all the different conversions that you're trying to drive through personalization, and then go through the exercise of both mapping them and then prioritizing them. This has a secondary value of scoring these, and ultimately the scores can be used within personalization engines as we implement different scenarios moving forward. But it's really helpful and valuable to go through the exercise of capturing all the different things, all the different conversions that you want your users to do, and ultimately the endpoints in a lot of cases for what are driving these different personalization scenarios, right? It's the first exercise that we go through overall. Next piece here is really being deliberate, again, around defining the audiences and the users to whom you're trying to personalize the experience. So we could talk for a long time about the nuances between personalizing through personas versus segments. There are certain instances, certain categories that behoove themselves more to personas. I mentioned the B2B example earlier, especially with the longer sales cycle, different audience types with different needs. Personas are oftentimes either required or highly recommended for those types of segments. But especially if you're starting out and you can actually drive some personalization scenarios through segments, that can be a much quicker way to market. So for example, if you are a regional business and you want to target specific users in a specific state, such as, consumers in Massachusetts, then you can really easily geo-target those people through your website and surface those, maybe an offer or a discount to those people on the website, just using that more simplified segment. So a lot of ways to go about that, but really being deliberate here about capturing who those are and then building them out accordingly. So we go through some pretty in-depth exercises. Again, we can done pretty quick in a workshop or two. But really mapping out who these folks are, what their perception is of their organization, the communication channels through which you communicate with them, and then for a given bucket or a given category, what are these subsegments that we can target to communicate them more granular level. And then as we map out the specific audiences, we're also interested in understanding the specific conversions and content that we're trying to drive for, right? So what is a CMO going to do with your organization on site, right? What are they coming and actually doing on your site? Similarly, what is the content that they're going to try to engage with, right? So we map these out and we basically rank them in order to source and inform the personalization scenarios that we end up implementing. So I mentioned earlier the beloved journey mapping exercise. So like I said earlier, this is where everyone always wants to get to. This really is the fun part. There's a lot to look at here, so I'm not going to go into it super in depth. Want to leave time for questions, but really what we do here is after capturing and organizing all the different inputs about your goals and your users and the audiences through which we're trying to personalize towards, we go through the end-to-end exercise of actually mapping out what each scenario would include. And we use this really as a tactical roadmap for ultimately implementing this within the technology setup. So a couple different things on this slide to note. Again, you can use this as a template moving forward if it's helpful for you. But what we're trying to do here is, on the upper top right, establish which segments, which audiences we're actually trying to reach. If through existing data analytics, you can validate or inform the actual estimated reach of this scenario, right? So if you're trying to target a specific geographic audience, what is the overall volume of those users that's coming to your site on a monthly basis, right? That can just inform the expected, basically, return on investment that each scenario brings. What conversions are supported in this scenario, right? So for the specific user group, what are we actually trying to get them to do through this personalization? And then the hypothesis, right? So this is critical piece of any personalization program it's sort of, it's a cycle, right? It's a test and learn approach. So you need to have a hypothesis about the why behind what you're doing. So you're going to implement this, you're going to spend the time to, put all the technology together, the data together, and the content together to support this scenario. What are you actually trying to drive towards? And what can you actually test as a hypothesis to prove whether or not it worked? And then a couple other pieces here, the technical requirements. Obviously, you need to set up and configure your website, your analytics, your personalization engine, which Mike will talk about more in a minute. Which channels are driving towards it, right? So you might have an email that's being sent to a customer, driving them to site. You might have a mobile app that you're trying to integrate in here. You might, pass data from these different touch points back to your CRM to capture that and use it for more personalization programs moving forward. And then what's the data requirement to support this as well, right? So what do we need to capture from the users, both to understand this scenario from the outset, but also implement it such that the personalization engine can surface the specific communication to these users. And then really important, one last note here, always contextualize each scenario that you put forth in terms of the value and the level of effort to implement it, right? So again, being very purposeful, what is the expected business value on a relative basis of implementing this scenario? What does it bring to the customer too, right? So you want to always be focused on your users. And then what's the level of effort? So anticipating, personalization does come always with that level of effort. So what do you need to do from a technical standpoint, a data standpoint to get this stood up? And look at that against the value that it's going to bring.
So to cover off with the strategy, obviously getting into the tool selection, that's a piece that you have to implement once you have these goals that you want to align with, once you have these sort of strategic paths you want to take. There are really three pieces of technology you need for implementing personalization that I just want to cover at a high level, just to give everyone a sense. So the first and foremost is you need a content repository. This goes back to that first piece about, personalization is not a button you push. You have to write all this content that can then be targeted to specific users and specific personas. So you could use something that's like API-based, say like Contentful, where you're writing your content and you're using an API to pull that content into your site or your digital channels. You could use something, if you're on Drupal, you could use Acquia Content Hub. I like this one because it's an outside-in approach. You could have your Content Hub on many of your digital properties, feeding content into this central place so that you can pull from that to really target individual people. Then you need some sort of user tracking. You need to be able to track your users, collect their data, and then use that for building your personalization rules. Again, you could use services that you may already be using, like Marketo, and connect that up through your digital applications to start pulling from qualified leads that you have and what you know about them. You could use something in Drupal, again, like Acquia Lift, which has user tracking, or Google Analytics, or Lift will connect with Marketo and Google Analytics, so that when people are visiting your website, you can start collecting anonymous information about them. When they become a qualified lead, you can connect that to the qualified profile you'll have and use that to target them even more. And then once you have the user tracking and the content, you can use a personalization engine to then build rules that target on that user data to deliver that content at the right time and in the right place. You could use a service like Optimizely. You could put that on top of your website and then write those rules to change content on the page. In Drupal, I like to use Acquia Lift, again, because it has that built-in user tracking, and it can also read from that content repository. So the value here I see in Drupal using Acquia Lift is that it's all connected, so there's scales of efficiency here. Your team who has to write that content can do it in a different environment, put it into Acquia Content Hub. Then you have Lift on your website where you can write those rules and it can do the user tracking for you and connect to those other services. So just 3 pieces of technology you need: content repository, some way to track users, and then the personalization engine to deliver and build those rule sets. With that, there's another piece about your strategy that you should always remember, which is to respect your users' privacy and protect your organization and protect your users. You know, there's things such as GDPR, CCPA, that all have to do with protecting user data and being transparent about how you're going to use it. So before you implement any personalization, talk with your legal counsel, figure out what you need to update for your privacy policy, to explain how you're using your user data, what purpose it's for, and then also give people options to opt in or opt out. So that's what we recommend anytime you're about to implement something for personalization, whether for the first time or you're changing your tactics or you're refining. Make this part of that process, that you're reflecting, okay, what do we have to update in our policies to make sure we're properly accounting for respecting our users' data and their privacy, and build that into your process as you implement personalization. So just real quickly, another case study on implementing a strategy for personalization is a case study for UL, Underwriters Laboratories. They've been around for 125 years, and when we went through this process of building this platform for them, so they're built on Acquia Cloud Site Factory, it made sense that, one, what they wanted to do was they have a bunch of different properties, digital properties. They wanted to feed content into it to all bubble up into their central ul.com website. So we were using Acquia Content Hub for that, so it made sense, knowing they had a conversion on industries and offerings and based on users' locations, to pull from that Content Hub. Well, Acquia Lift already did that, so we relied on that tool to implement on the home page, on first page load and other segments, to then start targeting users and passing them into Marketo or directing them into different sales funnels and delivering up industry content, offering content, and location-based content that made sense for those users. So we relied on Acquia Lift and Content Hub as technology that made sense for that strategy. So all this put together, the results of this program, is what you get is, right, you know your opportunity. You understand why you want personalized content, what value it's going to bring. You've defined goals that set that pathway of how you're going to measure that personalization is successful for your organization and your customers. And then you outline a framework and a strategy for how you're going to develop this solution. And that gives you this purpose-oriented plan of execution so that you can actually start building out personalization and implementing it in a way that delivers value with a purpose.
Yeah. As Mike mentioned earlier, we really want to drive home the fact that using personalization doing personalization is one thing, but it really needs to be a program, right? It's never a one-off activity. So it's a sort of virtuous cycle of coming up with hypotheses, configuring those hypotheses, iterating on them as you go, deploying those scenarios, and then monitoring and analyzing them. You can start small, start with 1 or 2 scenarios. Like I said, start with a couple segments that you want to personalize to with some limited content, test, see how those work, and begin to build a business case. Just make sure, as we've said throughout this, that you put together a purposeful plan with a team around it and a process that works for your organization so that you continue to grow and deliver value.
Awesome. I'm going to close it out by bringing up just one level. We're already getting some really good questions around kind of starting out and pilots and things like that. So that, works really well with the approach that we're advocating here. And like, we just talked about in terms of starting with some segments that you have, some data that you have, starting really small. We saw it in a bunch of those different case studies, making sure that there's lots of different endpoints and end results that you want to achieve when you're adopting a personalization practice. But our most successful customers here at Acquia, and I think we can say this generally, are the ones who are going to start with some things that maybe they're going to be able to have some fast results. Maybe they're lower effort, potentially a little bit lower impact for sure. But at the same time, they're going to be able to build, iterate, and understand, starting with the content and data that they have today in that crawl phase, starting to move into the walk phase, thinking, beyond that pilot program, taking some things you learn, maybe incorporating rather than maybe incorporating some behavioral components into your segments, augmenting those with additional engagements on multiple different sessions. And then in that run phase, maybe you're connecting 2 different systems or 3 different systems, like we talked about, analytics, Marketo, Salesforce, and really trying to kind of continue that journey in a more omni-channel way, not just on email, not just on website, but combining those experiences. And when we think about crawl, walk, run, we actually do have some kind of specifics in mind. We're not just thinking about this at a really high level. What we advise and what we've worked with our partners to kind of come up with is some recommendations at each of these stages and phases of personalization. So you can see things like at the crawl phase, geolocation. Whenever someone comes on your site with just some light tracking information, you're able to understand, even down to the zip code where they're coming from, being able to deliver different offers, different communications based on that. CHN, a great example there of giving relevant content for in-state folks versus out-of-state folks on their site. Marketing campaigns, anyone who's coming from an email or a certain UTM parameter on social. Visit frequency, nice easy one here. This is someone's first time to my site, or have they visited my site 10 times in a week? And what's the difference in experience there? And a device and system, another really common one at crawl. If someone's coming on an iPhone and I'm a college or university, for example, and they're coming on their iPhone on the weekend, maybe I'm going to send them some parking information. Versus if they're during the week on a laptop, maybe they're looking for 10 great reasons to go to this university. So some things like that. And I'm not going to go into all of them, but as we start to move into walk, we're augmenting the experience. So browsing behavior and visit frequency, or pages viewed plus device and system. So starting to think a little bit more comprehensively there. And at the run phase, building out some of those types of integrations, really thinking in a cross-channel way, maybe kind of up-leveling the complexity, things that maybe will have the highest impact in terms of ROI, conversion. But if you don't get started at those crawl phases, you really want to show success and impact and build some things out early and then build and iterate from there. And that's what we've seen to be really successful. So we can take into some questions now. One was from David. So thank you, David, for jumping in on that. So, we actually got a couple questions too around this concept of pilots, right? What's a great approach for starting a pilot? And David kind of was asking, kind of adding on to that, would you recommend starting a pilot at the top or the bottom of a sales funnel? So maybe I'll turn it over to Mike or to Gordon to kind of speak about, in general, what are some good examples of planning implementation for pilots, and then take that to where you should start in terms of the funnel.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would highly recommend doing, if you're trying to answer that question directly, I would highly recommend the exercise of mapping out your specific conversions that you're trying to drive towards, right? So given how you go to market, given your business and what users can do on the channel that you're trying to personalize for, your website, for example, what are those end conversions on site that you're trying to drive towards? How valuable are those to your organization? And how easy is it for you from an implementation standpoint, both from technology and content, to actually drive that scenario or that journey for them, right? So if you have a reasonably simple content website and you do lead gen through a form capture, what is a low-hanging fruit opportunity to personalize a homepage hero or a CTA on a detail page to get them into that funnel as quickly as possible? So it's looking at it through the lens of all your conversions and then the level of effort that you would need to extend in order to drive them to that outcome that you want.
Great. So that's a nice start there. I think one other question, I think you maybe have time for one or two more. One more, I think, based on the time. There's actually a question around machine learning. So using and leveraging machine learning capabilities to move away from inefficient manual practices. So I think this is a question, I think it's very topical for us at Acquia. It's something that, we have some capabilities that exist within Lyft. We have some stuff that exists within Agile One, our new recent acquisition around, machine learning tools and machine learning algorithms. I think that I'll start generally and then maybe move into some specific concepts, and then maybe I'll pass it over as well. But when we think about machine learning algorithms, automating segmentation, automatically recommending the right content are some really effective algorithms or ways to approach this. And one thing that, the conversations we have, whether it be with partners or customers, we're thinking that you really want to leverage machine learning algorithms to manage the execution layer, because the people that you have on your team, especially if you're a small team, you want to be able to have them focus on those higher level strategies and those mapping exercises like we heard, Mike and Gordon talking about earlier. So for us at Acquia, in Lyft, we have this machine learning content recommendation capability. So you can put on these always-on personalizations. They can automatically recommend content that would meet a certain type of subject or topic, and kind of consistently get those experiences. So at the top level, maybe your pilot pages, or maybe your kind of campaign pages or your home pages, you're able to think strategically about what types of personalizations you can use there. So I don't think it's a replacement. I think it's an augmentation, especially when you have smaller teams. I'm not sure if Michael or Gordon, you had other thoughts on kind of machine learning, whether it be specific algorithms you found useful, or just kind of at a high level what that approach should look like.
Well, at a high level, what I wanted to add to what you just said, Eric, is that machine learning is still technology, it's still a tool. So remember, personalization is not a product you buy. The tool is going to help you. So you still need to pay attention to defining those goals for success and what that means in your personalization process, because you need to be able to tell the machine learning algorithms that these are the sort of outcomes we want to achieve, and then let the machine figure out how to do that. But if you're not doing that practice and you just kind of let the machine do what it wants, so to speak, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to turn into some valuable returns for you. You're not going to get the success you're looking for. You're not going to get the conversions you're looking for. So still doing that process of outlining those goals, and then, like Eric said, using machine learning to augment having a team manually implement those rule sets to let it do that, but you're driving it through goals you still have to define and personas you have to define.
And then there's the tail end of that too, right? As you develop a notion of a persona or a segment within your system, and you have certain rule sets that continue to validate and enforce, user X against that persona, you have to go back and ensure that, given the rules that you've set up and the algorithms that you're using, that persona is indeed being validated in the correct manner. So there's still some manual overhead that goes into that, but the tools nonetheless can still be powerful to take some of that overhead away from your team.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great point. I love mapping it back to kind of that thought process around personalization too, right? Personalization is a technology. You have to add, in the same way that machine learning is, you really need to be thoughtful about how you're going to leverage those technologies to achieve relevant business outcomes. So thanks. Those are really good thoughts.
All right, that is all we have time for today. Thank you, Mike, Gordon, and Eric, and thank you all again for attending our webinar. As I said previously, slides and the recording of this webinar will be posted to acquia.com and also sent to you via email within the next few days. And if you have any additional questions, please send them to marketing@theacquiateam.com. All right, thank you so much and have a great day.